At the sprawling aviation grounds of Fort Horizon in Alabama, the sound of rotor blades cut through the crisp morning air like a war drum. In the distance, rows of attack helicopters gleamed under the sun, their shadows stretching across the tarmac. As crews prepared for another day of rigorous training, among them was Captain Sophia Rivers, a pilot whose skill in the cockpit had drawn both admiration and scrutiny from her peers. At 28 years old, Sophia had already proven herself in countless evaluations. Her hands worked the controls of the AH-64 Viper with the precision of a concert pianist. Her navigation scores were flawless, her mastery of weapon systems unmatched, and in the calm of perfect weather, she was a force of nature herself. But that calm was part of the problem. The day would always come when the skies turned hostile, and that was where the shadows began to creep into her record. In the pristine simulator rooms, Chief Warrant Officer Robert Vega had watched her performance in adverse weather scenarios again and again. The data did not lie. When wind and turbulence filled the simulated skies, her control faltered, not disastrously, but enough to raise alarms. Vega respected her drive, but the reality was clear: combat missions did not wait for blue skies. Sophia sat in the humming cockpit of the simulator, her fingers tightening around the cyclic and collective as the screens around her filled with storm clouds. The simulated winds yanked at her virtual aircraft like invisible hands. Rain streaked across the canopy, reducing her view to a smear of gray. She felt every jolt, every sway, and deep down she knew what the instructors saw as a weakness, she saw as an untamed challenge. Robert's voice came through the headset like a steady metronome, urging her to hold altitude, to keep her vector steady. As the simulated storm tossed her around, the Viper bucked under the sudden crosswind, her instruments flickering in the dim glow. She answered calmly that she was developing a set of flight techniques to counter this, that she was learning how to feel the atmosphere as if it were part of the machine itself. Colonel Emma Talbot, commander of the training program, reviewed the latest set of results in her office lined with maps of combat zones. Her gaze moved from the data sheet to Sophia with a measured calm. She explained that attack helicopter pilots had to be prepared for every sky, that storms, hurricanes, and darkness were not exceptions, but guarantees. Failure in those conditions could mean losing lives on the ground. Sophia listened, her mind replaying the countless hours she had spent studying weather systems, reading meteorology reports, and learning how wind shear interacted with rotor dynamics. She had always been drawn to patterns and chaos, and she began to suspect that her heightened reaction to turbulent skies was not a flaw, but an unrefined advantage. While others saw a storm as an enemy, she saw it as a partner whose moods could be read and whose strength could be channeled. Major Michael Barrett, her primary instructor, had his doubts, yet he could not deny her grasp of aerodynamics exceeded that of most pilots he had trained. He reminded her that instinct mattered more than theory. When the sky turned into a wall of rain and wind and visibility dropped to nothing, he said that in those moments the body and mind had to act as one, with no time to debate a maneuver or check a chart. But Sophia had something else in mind. She believed that those who understood the personality of the sky could learn to predict its strikes and shifts. She pored over flight logs from pilots who had skirted hurricanes, dissecting the way they used headwinds to slow descents or tailwinds to accelerate climbs. In her notebook, pages filled with swirling arrows and wind diagrams showed how gusts could be used to pivot the aircraft more sharply than the controls alone would allow. Months passed in a cycle of drills, lectures, and simulated storms. The other pilots saw her in the hangars long after official training ended, running through weather simulations alone. Lights dimmed, and the roar of digital storms echoed as she tested control inputs again and again. Each mistake became a mark in her growing manual of storm flying techniques. Each recovery became proof that she was learning to dance with the wind rather than fight it. Still, the final evaluation loomed, and the records of her weather performance hung over her like a dark cloud. This was the last obstacle before certification, and she knew the instructors were watching not just for improvement, but for proof that she could keep control in chaos. For most pilots, that meant keeping the aircraft steady. For Sophia, it meant something different. It meant finding ways to make the chaos her ally. On the morning of her last trial, the sun rose over Fort Horizon with deceptive beauty. The winds were light, the skies clear, yet she knew the simulator room would soon be filled with virtual lightning and invisible hands pulling at her controls. As she strapped in, she closed her eyes not to shut out fear, but to imagine the roar of real storms, the scent of wet air, and the way the wind might carry her if she let it. The simulated horizon darkened. The first gust struck the Viper, swayed under her hands, but this time she did not resist. She shifted with the wind, using its force to roll into a bank that lined her up perfectly for the next waypoint. Rain pelted her canopy, but her eyes were on the instruments, and her mind was on the air itself. Every gust had a rhythm, every pocket of turbulence had a direction. When the session ended, Robert Vega leaned forward, his brow furrowed, not in disappointment, but in thought. Sophia had done more than hold her own. She had found ways to let the simulated storm push her where she needed to go. For the first time, there was a hint of curiosity in his eyes, as though he wondered what she might do if given a real sky and a real storm to test her theories. Sophia left the simulator that day, feeling a shift within her. The path ahead would not be easy, but she knew the only way to prove herself was to meet a storm in its own territory and come back not merely intact, but victorious. She did not yet know when or where that storm would find her, but in her bones she felt certain that day was coming, and when it did, she would be ready to fly not against the wind, but with it. 7 months passed since Sophia Rivers had completed her final evaluation at Fort Horizon, and in that time, she had earned her certification and flown multiple training operations in varied conditions, yet no mission had truly tested the theories she had been shaping in her mind. The long hours, studying weather charts, the sleepless nights, reviewing rotorcraft dynamics in turbulent airflow, and the endless simulator sessions had given her confidence, but she knew that the true test would come when the sky itself turned against her. That test arrived in the form of Hurricane Valeria, a massive and unforgiving Category 4 storm that had been churning its way across the Gulf for days, gathering strength and fury. It was the kind of storm that turned coastlines into battlegrounds of wind and water. The meteorologist spoke of sustained winds of nearly 150 miles per hour and gusts capable of toppling concrete. The air pressure had plummeted, and the outer bands already lashed the Texas Gulf Coast with horizontal rain. The storm was not just a weather event, it was a force of nature that defied reason. Yet there was another force moving in the shadows. As Valeria approached, an enemy force had slipped into the chaos, establishing a heavily fortified beachhead near the city of Grayston. 15 armored battle tanks and waves of infantry had landed under the cover of the storm, using the weather as their shield. Their objective was clear seas, vital coastal infrastructure, before reinforcements could arrive, with the storm grounding conventional aircraft and most helicopters. The enemy calculated that they had 12 to 18 hours to entrench their position. At Ellington Field outside Houston, the atmosphere inside the command center was tense. Officers and analysts stood over maps cluttered with red markers, showing enemy positions. Blue lines represented friendly ground units, but they were pinned down by flooded roads and blocked routes. Time was running out. The standard playbook offered no solution until Colonel Emma Talbot turned towards Sophia with an expression that mixed urgency and challenge. "Captain Rivers, you are being assigned to Viper Solo 1 for Operation Gale Strike. Your mission is to provide close air support against enemy armor positions during the height of the hurricane." The words landed like thunder in Sophia's mind. She knew the risks. The storm's power alone could tear an aircraft apart. Visibility would be nearly zero. The winds could flip her helicopter mid-flight, but she also felt the spark of opportunity. In the operations briefing room, meteorological data filled the screens, swirling wind patterns overlaid with thermal imaging projections. The storm's eye was a vast spiral of fury moving toward landfall, and within its bands were the gaps, the corridors of wind Sophia had spent years theorizing about. She studied the charts with an intensity that silenced the room, tracing invisible pathways through the storm's anatomy. She could already see the potential routes the wind might give her if she knew how to ride it. Chief Warrant Officer Robert Vega had flown in from Fort Horizon to support the operation. Though his face carried deep skepticism, he reminded her that these were not simulated conditions. These winds violated every safety guideline known. The gusts alone could shear the rotors from the airframe, and debris flying at lethal speeds could tear through the cockpit. Yet Sophia responded calmly. She had studied Valeria's wind signature for hours and believed the storm's energy could be used rather than thought the key was to work with the hurricane's rhythm instead of resisting it. Preparations began immediately. The ground crew moved with urgent precision, checking every component of the AH-64 Viper that would carry her into the storm. Extra reinforcement was added to the rotor blades, and sensors were recalibrated for maximum performance. In poor visibility, Sophia oversaw the modifications, personally running her gloved hands over the fuselage, as if to reassure the aircraft that they were about to do something no one else dared to attempt. By early afternoon, the first wall of the hurricane struck the coastline. Torrential rain hammered the hangars and water pooled across the runways. The wind howled like a living creature outside. Visibility dropped to a smear of gray and white, yet Sophia walked toward the Viper with steady steps. The ground crew fastened her helmet and ran through final checks, but every eye carried the unspoken question, could she even make it past the airfield in this? At 1400 hours, the mission launched. The Viper's engines roared against the screaming wind, the rotors cutting through sheets of rain. Sophia lifted off, feeling the machine shudder under the assault, but also sensing the familiar rhythm she had come to know. The first gust pushed against her side, and she allowed it to guide her into a turn, aligning her with the storm's outer bands rather than fighting to hold a rigid course. As she climbed into the turbulent sky, the storm's fury surrounded her. Rain struck the canopy with the force of gravel. The wind currents shifted direction without warning, threatening to twist the helicopter off course. Yet within that chaos, she began to read the pattern. Small lulls between gusts acted like stepping stones. Sharp crosswinds provided opportunities to pivot with greater speed than the tail rotor could manage on its own. The closer she drew to Greyston's coastline, the more she felt her months of study coming alive. Every chart she had memorized, every wind diagram she had drawn seemed to materialize around her. The storm was not random, it had structure, and Sophia was flying through its architecture. Her first report came as she entered the operational area. Visibility near zero, she stated, but detecting wind patterns that may offer tactical positioning on her sensors. The thermal imaging lit up with faint signatures. 15 armored vehicles arranged in defensive positions along the beach. The enemy believed the storm rendered them invisible to air attack, but they had not counted on someone who could see through the hurricane's veil. Sophia's voice remained calm as she relayed the contact points. The storm is providing perfect cover for approach. They cannot hear or see me until I am already in firing position. Ground control listened in silence, aware that the next moments would determine not just the mission's outcome, but the credibility of extreme weather combat flying itself. The first target came in a range. The wind seemed to shift in her favor, pushing the Viper into an angle that stabilized her weapon's platform in conditions that should have made precision impossible. She locked onto the tank's heat signature and loosed a missile. The explosion bloomed through the sheets of rain, a brief flare swallowed quickly by the storm. Yet in that moment, Sophia knew the storm was no longer an adversary. It was her partner. The destruction of the first armored target sent ripples through the chaos of the battlefield. Though the enemy could not yet pinpoint the source, the roar of the hurricane masked the Viper's engines, and the thick wall of rain concealed its silhouette from her cockpit. Sophia Rivers felt a surge of focus. This was no longer about proving her theories to instructors or skeptics. This was about reshaping what was possible in the art of aerial warfare. She let the hurricane's rhythm carry her deeper into the operational zone. The rain lashed the canopy in streaks, the wind striking at the fuselage with fists of air. Yet inside the storm, she began to sense the invisible roads, the air currents that could lift her into position faster than any manual climb. She was not forcing the Viper through resistance. She was letting the atmosphere itself accelerate her maneuvers. Enemy thermal signatures flickered across her display, each tank a glowing ember against the cold wash of wind and water. The heat differentials caused by the storm made the target stand out more sharply than in clear conditions where ground temperatures could blur the image. What most pilots would have seen as a hindrance, Sophia saw as a magnifier. She swung into position for the second strike, allowing a crosswind to pivot her helicopter in a sharp yaw that would have been impossible without the storm's assistance. The missile streaked away, and another tank disappeared from the map. Shrapnel clanged against the Viper's armored skin, but the craft held steady. The storm pressed against her again, and she used it to bank toward her next target. With each attack run, she grew more attuned to the hurricane's breathing. The gusts were like waves in the ocean, each one predictable. If you knew how to read the signs, the updrafts lifted her. When she needed altitude, the downdrafts pushed her into rapid descents. Without straining the rotors, she could feel the line between control and chaos narrowing, yet her instincts sharpened within that space. On the ground, the enemy scrambled to respond. Anti-aircraft crews tried to lock onto her position, but their systems faltered in the violent winds. Even if they caught a glimpse of her, it was gone in a second, as she slipped behind a wall of rain or let the wind shear carry her laterally out of their targeting arc. Sophia understood she had found the perfect hunting ground. The very storm that kept other aircraft grounded was cloaking her movements and shielding her from return fire. Targets 3 and 4 erupted in flashes of light, swallowed instantly by the gray around her. The hurricane was no longer just a backdrop. It was a living environment, a battlefield that shifted and breathed. A wall of wind would slam into the Viper, forcing a roll, and she would emerge from it perfectly aligned for another strike. She was no longer adhering to the standard flight patterns that pilots were drilled to follow. Instead, she was drawing entirely new lines in the sky. The communication channel crackled with reports from ground control, enemy infantry abandoning some positions, tanks moving erratically, unable to predict her approach. Each time she relocated, she did so with a speed that seemed impossible given the weather. The truth was she was not cutting through the storm as much as she was flowing with it. Her mind processed more than the positions of enemy units. She calculated the timing of wind gusts against her own velocity. She noted how the rain curtain shifted when larger debris was swept by, hinting at stronger currents ahead. The storm had become a vast three-dimensional chessboard, and she was learning to play in all its dimensions at once. By the time she eliminated her 6th and 7th targets, the coastline was erupting in chaos. Enemy forces were scattering, their armored spearhead blunted before it could dig, and the hurricane howled louder around her. But instead of pushing back, she leaned into it, letting the tailwind sling her toward her next vector. Then the forward controller reported new contacts, reinforcements pushing inland, additional armor and mobile missile systems moving to set up fresh defenses. In standard doctrine, this would be the point to withdraw, regroup, and wait for better weather. But Sophia's voice was steady as she acknowledged she could see them on her thermal display, and the same storm that shielded her from their vision was about to be the blade she would use to cut through them. She accelerated into the wind, riding a natural corridor that sliced between the rain bands. Her path was not direct, but curved like an arrow knocked on a bowstring drawn by the hurricane itself. The sudden burst of tailwind carried her in a striking range faster than the enemy could orient their weapons. Her 8th target erupted in a plume of fire and shrapnel before its crew had a chance to react. Sophia kept moving, never lingering in one place long enough to be tracked. The 9th target fell under another precision strike, and then she turned her attention to the missile batteries. They were the real threat. If they managed to get a lock, even the storm's cover might not save her. She used a vertical wind column to climb rapidly above them, then dove through the eye wall into a steep attack angle. The first missile battery disintegrated in a fireball, followed seconds later by the second. Through it all, her control inputs were smooth, never fighting the air, but coaxing it to work for her. The storm was no longer just an environment. It was a weapon, and she wielded it like an extension of her own machine. Each victory added weight to the truth she had always believed: the sky, no matter how violent, could be read, understood, and mastered. By the time she circled back toward the coastline, she had dismantled the enemy's reinforcements piece by piece. The hurricane raged on, unrelenting, yet within its fury Sophia Rivers was untouchable. She had crossed the invisible boundary between surviving in a storm and dominating it. And in doing so, she had begun to break the rules that every pilot before her had been taught to follow. The hurricane roared like an ocean of wind around Sophia Rivers, yet inside the cockpit, she felt an almost unnatural calm. Her breathing was steady, her hands light on the controls. The battle outside was chaos, but within the chaos, she saw a pattern, a living rhythm that she could ride, just as a surfer rides the crest of a wave. The enemy forces were trying to adapt. Their remaining tanks had shifted position, using the strongest gusts to mask their movements. Mobile missile launchers were set up at strategic choke points, hoping to catch her. In the open, the logic was sound, but they misunderstood one thing. They believed the hurricane was their ally because it kept most aircraft grounded. Sophia knew better. The hurricane was her ally because she had learned to speak its language. On her display, the thermal outlines of the final armored units glowed like embers in the gray void. She noted how their movements aligned with the storm's pulses. The tanks would creep forward in the seconds after a gust. When visibility dropped even lower, then they would hold position, waiting for the next window of obscurity. Sophia saw the trap. they were trying to set, but also saw the flaw in it. They were moving predictably because the storm dictated their timing. She eased the Viper into a holding pattern at the edge of a massive wind corridor. The air current tugged at the aircraft like a river pulling at a drifting leaf. She let the pull guide her, waiting for the exact moment when the next rotation of the storm would open a direct path to the targets. The seconds stretched, then the wind shifted with a sudden rush, and she released the hold. The Viper surged forward, as if slingshot by the hurricane itself. The first tank appeared through the rain only for an instant, but that instant was enough. She adjusted her angle using a crosswind to steady her aim and released a missile. The explosion was muffled by the wind, swallowed almost instantly by the storm's roar. Without breaking momentum, she dipped into a downdraft, letting it drop her closer to the second target before pulling up sharply. The rotor strained, but held the machine steady as another shot found its mark. Enemy anti-aircraft crews fired blindly into the gray arcs of tracer fire, cutting through the sheets of rain. Yet every time they thought they had her position, she was already gone, carried laterally by an invisible hand of wind. She had become a ghost in the storm, never approaching from the same direction, twice, never moving in a way that could be tracked. The third and fourth targets tried to retreat inland using the storm's cover, but Sophia was already there. The hurricane's spiraling arms had created a looping air current that allowed her to cut across their path faster than they could react. She attacked from above, diving through a break in the rain band and striking before they could even turn their turrets. By now, the ground controllers were speaking in tones of disbelief. The mission parameters had been designed with the expectation of partial success at best. Yet Sophia had dismantled the armored spearhead with a precision that seemed impossible in such conditions. Each strike had been calculated not just for accuracy, but for timing with the storm's own heartbeat. Sophia's eyes scanned the displays for the final three tanks. They were attempting to break away entirely, driving into the interior under the assumption that she could not follow at high speed in hurricane winds. She smiled faintly under her helmet. The very currents they thought would protect them were the ones she planned to use for the final run. She climbed into a towering updraft, letting it lift her without overtaxing the engines. From the peak, she could see faint outlines of the retreating armor through the haze. She banked into a turn, letting a tailwind push her into a dive. The Viper howled downward, the wind sharpening her descent into a straight line toward the lead vehicle. Her missile struck, and the explosion bloomed through the sheets of rain. Before the others could scatter, she rode the recoil of the wind into another firing angle. Her second shot obliterated the next tank, and the final target erupted moments later as debris spiraled into the gale. The mission was complete. 15 tanks destroyed, multiple missile systems neutralized, and the enemy infantry scattered beyond recovery. Sophia took a slow breath, letting the reality of it settle. The storm still raged, but in her mind it had already transformed from an obstacle into a partner. The rules that had grounded generations of pilots no longer applied. She had shown that the sky, no matter how violent, could be used as a weapon rather than feared as an enemy. As she turned the Viper toward base, the wind seemed to ease slightly, as if acknowledging her mastery. She had not simply survived the hurricane, she had conquered it. She had proven that human skill and natural fury could work in unison, and in doing so, she had rewritten a chapter of aerial combat history. The return flight to Ellington Field carried a strange stillness inside Sophia Rivers' mind. Despite the hurricane's relentless roar around her, the Viper moved with a confidence that mirrored her own, its rotors slicing through the dense curtains of rain, as if they had always belonged there. The coastline she left behind was littered with burning wreckage, enemy armor reduced to twisted metal, and their plans shattered before they could take root. Ground control's voice came through the headset. Steady now that the immediate chaos had passed, they confirmed the mission's success. All enemy forces neutralized. The beachhead eliminated the reinforcements. Scatter the numbers were staggering. 15 tanks destroyed, along with missile batteries and support vehicles, and all of it achieved solo during the height of a Category 4 hurricane. As the airfield came into view, the wind still tugged and shoved at the Viper, but Sophia no longer resisted out of reflex. She had learned that resistance only drained energy. Instead, she let the gusts adjust her path, subtly guiding her toward the runway. The landing gear touched the wet concrete with a soft thud and the rotors slowed until the howl of the storm reclaimed dominance over the airfield. When she stepped down from the cockpit, the gathered officers and ground crew stared at her with a mix of awe and disbelief. Colonel Emma Talbot was the first to approach, her expression one of controlled pride. She told Sophia that what had been accomplished today was beyond anything the flight manuals had ever envisioned, that her tactics had expanded the boundaries of what military aviation considered possible. Chief Warrant Officer Robert Vega stood nearby, arms folded, but with the faintest hint of a smile. He had once questioned whether Sophia could handle extreme weather at all, and now he admitted that she had not merely handled it, she had turned it into a weapon. He told her that in his 20 years of flying, he had never seen anyone merge with a storm the way she had. Major Michael Barrett, her longtime instructor, added his own reflection. He recalled how he had mistaken her sensitivity to weather for a weakness, when in truth it had been the foundation of her unique skill set. That heightened awareness had allowed her to read the storm's shifts, anticipate its strikes, and transform its chaos into precision. In the days that followed, the military recorded every detail of the mission, the telemetry data, the targeting footage, the wind pattern overlays. All of it became part of a new body of research on extreme weather combat operations. The after-action reports labeled it unprecedented, the most successful solo helicopter engagement in severe weather on record. Soon Sophia found herself at the center of an entirely new doctrine. She was assigned to lead the Extreme Weather Aviation Research Division at Fort Horizon, a program dedicated to training pilots to operate in conditions once considered impossible. Her approach, which became known as the Rivers Protocol, emphasized treating storms not as barriers, but as environments with exploitable structures. Pilots were taught to read the rhythm of wind bands, to use updrafts and downdrafts for positioning, too. Treat pressure shifts as opportunities for weapon stabilization. The results spread far beyond her own unit. Other branches began sending pilots to study under her methods. International allies requested joint training exercises. Her combat footage was shown in flight academies not as a cautionary tale, but as a model of innovation under fire. The image of her Viper cutting through the gray wall of Hurricane Valeria became an enduring symbol of tactical adaptability. For Sophia, the legacy was not in the destruction of the enemy vehicles, though that victory had turned the tide in a critical moment. It was in the shift of perspective she had forced upon the aviation community. For decades, storms have been seen only as obstacles that grounded operations. She had shown they could be transformed into allies, into weapons, even into shields when understood correctly. She often addressed young pilots, now standing where she once stood in the simulator rooms with storms looming on the screens. She would tell them never to see the weather as just a threat. Every storm has structure, and if you can learn its rhythm, you can use it to your advantage. Do not fight the wind dance with it. The sky will always belong to those who understand it best. And when the recruits asked her if she had ever feared the hurricane, she would smile and explain that fear was not the right word. Respect was the storm was not an enemy to be crushed, but a partner whose strength could magnify her own if she moved with it rather than against it. That philosophy had carried her through the most dangerous mission of her life, and it would carry others through theirs. The day would come again when the clouds blackened the horizon and the wind began to howl. Pilots trained in the Rivers Protocol would lift off into that fury, not with hesitation, but with purpose. They would ride the hidden corridors of the sky. They would strike unseen, and they would return with their aircraft intact and their mission complete. Sophia Rivers had written her name in the language of the wind and fire of battle. She had proven that sometimes the greatest victories come not by defying nature, but by joining forces with it. And long after the wreckage of that storm cleared, the lesson remained: every storm holds a path for those who can see it, and sometimes the pilot everyone thinks will falter in the tempest is the one who will soar the highest through it.